Good evening, West Main family. We trust that everybody's doing well and staying safe and staying healthy. You know, this is an unprecedented and strange time, as we've mentioned over and over and over. And in some ways, it takes us back to what we might think of as a simpler time. You know, we're at home and we're spending time at things around the house. Some people may be gardening, others may be doing home improvement projects. But there's just kind of those simpler things of life are occupying our time. And really, there's a value to the simpler things in life. I think we've always recognized that. When I was young, the Judds had a song out called "Grandpa, Tell Me About the Good Old Days." And throughout the song, it was simply reflecting upon the fact that things in the fast-paced modern world have changed so quickly, and that there's a quality, there's certainly a benefit to when life was a little slower, when life was a little simpler, during the times of our forefathers. And so I think this time that we have to spend more time with family, more time just doing simpler things and having a simpler life, I think that will perhaps provide us with an opportunity to reflect upon things that used to matter more than they have mattered recently. And perhaps to if you would, re-explore those things that should matter more in our lives when we got caught up in the rat race. Over in the book of Genesis chapter 26, if we look at verse 18, it says, "Then Isaac dug again the wells of water, which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father. For the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them." So here it says, and this is just a very simple little verse recounting an event where Isaac redigs the wells of his father Abraham, because those wells had been filled back in by the Philistines. Now, I know he's not trying to make some powerful point, but I think that there is something that we can draw from this. And that is, when in the New Testament and in the Old Testament times, when they were talking about a well, wells were very important things. Remember, Jesus went to Jacob's well and he met the woman at the well at that place. And people from all around that city would come out and draw the life-giving water. Jesus would use the illustration that if she would just ask of him, he would be that source of life-giving water. He would give her drink from which she would never thirst again. So wells as a source of water are super important. And it says here that Isaac went and redug his father's well because his father's well had been filled in by the Philistines. There was no more life-giving water coming from it. Well, I want to use that as an analogy to basically communicate that perhaps it's time that we redig some of our forefathers' wells. Some of the things that mattered back when our grandparents were young. Back when the world was simpler. Because some of the water, if you will, some of the things that flowed out of those old wells, out of those old principles which guided life, those are things that this world can use again, that we personally can use, and in faith that we can grow from again. Maybe it's time that we spend this unique period in our lives to redig some old wells. Wells that perhaps we've forgotten all of the blessings that can come from them. The wells of our fathers. Well, there are several ways that we can apply this, but I think one well of our forefathers that society has long filled in and forgotten is the well of personal integrity. My grandpa used to tell me that in his town, that when he lived in the same community his entire life, and my grandpa, he was beloved by everybody. He never had any money, but he ran the town's little junkyard. And he had an entire drawer full of pocket watches and Barlow knives and all sorts of stuff. And I'd asked him before, "Grandpa, where'd you get all this junk?" And he said, Well, I said, I traded those for parts through the years. Because he basically had a policy that if somebody needed a part, an alternator for their car or a water pump or whatever it was, that he wasn't going to let them leave if they could afford it or not. So he'd let them trade their pocket knives or trade their watch or whatever it may be. And when he died, the line for his funeral was way around the block. Because everybody said, you know, Jimmy Williams, he always was kind and he always was honest. You see, that honesty, that personal integrity. There was a time, years and years ago, that in smaller communities like the one that we live in, that banks didn't have to run a credit report. Because if they knew you, they knew if you were a good person, if you paid your bills. They knew your word was your word. Your word was your bond. You see, our forefathers dug wells of personal integrity. When they gave their word, they meant it. When they said something, they stuck to it. And in our world today, well, that's in many, many ways been forgotten. I heard a little story of a farmer who was asking the veterinarian. He asked him, he said, you know, I have this horse and I don't understand because sometimes he limps and other times he walks just fine. And he says, it's just kind of, there's no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes he limps, sometimes he's fine. What should I do? And the veterinarian told him, well, next time he's walking fine, sell him. You see, that's the kind of advice that a lot of folks in our world today, because that well of personal integrity has been forgotten and filled in. That's the kind of advice the world would give. But you see, that's not the advice of an honest man. There's so many illustrations of this. I heard of a sports team several years ago who was making a run to the state championship. They'd had a few losses, but they had kind of an amazing run in the playoffs and finally won the state championship. But their trophy case in their school, it remained empty because they found out after the whole tournament was over that in the very first game of the tournament, one they had won easily, for 45 seconds, one young athlete had played that was ineligible because of his grades. They didn't realize it at the time. He wasn't an impact player. He'd only played for 45 seconds. And they reported it to the State Athletic Association, and because of that, their victory was vacated. And some of the parents and some of the community were upset and said, why did you even tell him? What did it matter? He didn't make any difference. He only played for 45 seconds. And the coach said, well, you know, sure enough, we didn't bring home the trophy, but we did teach our young people something. We taught them that integrity matters, honesty, that it doesn't matter if you win, if you're not honest in the victory. When we look over in Scripture in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, I think we see a great example of this well of personal integrity. In talking about Daniel, it says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then Daniel distinguished himself above all the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was found in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. And they could find no charge, no fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. These men said, we shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Here, Daniel is of such powerful personal integrity that he who had come to Babylon as a slave boy, he is risen to one of the 3 or 4 top men in the entire kingdom. And the king is so impressed with him that he thinks to set him over everything. And even his enemies, and this is the part that to me is the most impressive, even his enemies When they look at Daniel, they say, we're not going to be able to find anything wrong. We can dig through all the skeletons in his closet, and there's not going to be anything there, because this is a man who lives his life with real integrity. You see, Daniel had moved far away from the land of his fathers, but he still dug into the wells of his father's integrity. He still drank from that well, and he exhibited that integrity to the world. That was a time, as we said, in this country when people were honest. When their word meant their word. When their yes meant yes and their no meant no. And so we need to be a people who redig those wells of our fathers and find personal integrity again. The second well that I think has been forgotten from our forefathers in some ways is the well of kindness to others, kindness to our neighbor. You know, there's a personal connection that human beings need, and when they're touched by it, it really it can make such an impact in people's lives. I read about a little lady who loved going to the post office. She was a widow. She lived by herself. She didn't have much interaction with other people. And we all can kind of understand that now because we're all kind of isolated. But she didn't have much interaction. So she'd go to the post office almost every day. And she'd stand in line and she'd talk to the folks at the counter and she'd get her stamps and she'd mail her little letters or her cards or whatever. And one time around Christmas, she was there at the post office and the line was just so long. And somebody in line, they noticed that she just had a couple of letters and was going to buy a few stamps. And they said to her, they said, you know, you don't have to stand here. There's a stamp machine out in the lobby. And the old lady said, well, you know, I know. But she said, the stamp machine never asks me about my arthritis. You see, she was wanting that personal human connection, that kindness that had always been shown to her. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5, Paul says it this way. He says, let your gentleness be known to all mankind, because the Lord is at hand. Let your gentleness be known to all mankind. We're people who, the scriptures tell us, do good to all, but especially the household of faith. We're supposed to be a people who, it tells us, are, if at all possible, live at peace with all men. Christians should be the nicest people that anybody knows. Of all the folks that you work with, all of us, this is true. If we're Christians, then everybody in that office, if you ask them, who's the nicest person? Who's the kindest person? Who's the greatest servant in your office? They should think of the believer, of the Christ follower, before they think of anyone else. Because that is a well, like I mentioned about my grandpa, he never let anybody leave without the part they needed. He never, ever would not treat someone with dignity and kindness. And that's why the line was all the way around the block at his funeral. That's the well that our fathers understood. Loving your neighbor, sitting on your front porch and caring about the people next to you. The well of kindness to others. And then the third thing I think the third well we need to redig and learn from our forefathers from a simpler time is the well of conviction. In Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, we see the story of Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And you'll remember that Nebuchadnezzar had decided that all would bow down to an image that he'd erected and would worship him. And these three, they refuse. So they're pulled before him. And it says in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. For if this is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. And I look at the courage of these young men, and it's inspiring. Here they stand before the King of the world, who has the power of life and death in his very word. And he says to them, you will bow down and worship me, or I will throw you into this fiery furnace. And they say, King, we're not going to do it because we believe our God can deliver us. But I love this part. But even if he doesn't, but even if God doesn't deliver us, we will not ever bow down and worship you. You see, their conviction was so powerful, they even were willing to keep their conviction even to the point of death. We have a great heritage in the Lord's church of conviction. Our fathers stood against Roman emperors. Our forefathers, they were killed in the arenas and the Colosseum of Rome. They have stood up to all sorts of persecution, sword, famine, suffering, difficulty. We must redig those old wells of conviction. And as God's people, be a people that even in weird times like this, we don't know what the economy is going to do. We don't know when we're all getting back to work and when things will go back to normal. But whatever happens, we need to be a people that say, no matter what, we're going to have the conviction of our forefathers. And we're going to serve the Lord, even with our last breath. You see, when it comes to this idea of a simpler life, as the song said, Grandpa, tell me about the good old days. Back when life was simple. Well, for many of us, life has become a lot simpler the last few weeks. But how will we use it? I hope that we'll all reflect upon the good things about yesterday, the good things about simpler times, and reconnect to those things, and then strive to redig those wells of our fathers, the wells of personal integrity. Our yes is our yes, our no is our no, people of honesty and truth. The well of kindness to other people, of determining to be a people who treat others with goodness, and the well of absolute personal conviction that says, I'm going to serve the Lord. I'm going to serve him when things are good, when this economy get back to normal and things are going great, I'm going to serve him. But if this lasts the rest of my life, I'm going to serve him because my convictions, my faith is not dependent upon my circumstances. I'm going to serve the Lord. Well, I hope everyone is staying happy and healthy and safe. You know that if you have any needs, you can reach out to the elders of the West Main Church or to myself, Nathan, any of the rest of the staff or the deacons. And please know that we love you. We're praying for you. We care about everyone, and that we all just need to hang in there because things will get better. As long as the Lord is still the Lord, and he is, and his promises are still true, and they always are, there's always great hope for tomorrow. We love you.